a generation, what you hear today about generations, and you hear all these names, right? Particularly today, tech generation or I generation or Z, most of those names are just wrong. And we won't really get a good name until we get further out in time. And this is always the challenge of the historian. The historian really knows nothing until about 60 years back. That's why, as I told my wife, I kind of don't really like modern history. We kind of want somebody to tell us what happened with, say, President Obama, because it happened 8 years ago, 10 years ago, right? So it's cool, it is history. But at the same time, it's all current events. Until you get about 50 years back, no historian worth their salt can really adequately say this is what happened. Or as I like to tell my students, almost every sentence ought to be finished with ... as best we know the evidence. When you get 75 to 100 years back, you usually have most of the evidence. Not always. We still don't have all the evidence, say, from what happened in World War I, World War II, because the Soviet Union has still not fully opened their archives to the West. Which is fine, that's their right, but you can imagine the Soviet Union was a key player in both those events. So knowing their take and their narrative and their information will inform us at a deeper level as historians as to what really happened in World War I, World War II. I look forward to that day, although I will be dead before it really happens. So you kind of always are looking ahead. So it'll be future sociologists and anthropologists who will really adequately be able to give us a name for some of these places. But in broad terms, you can think what happens for a generation is that a generation has these things going on. So one of the things I liked about Strauss and Hall, and the way I focused on it, is it's not about demographics, but it's much more about what's happening sociologically. And that becomes a key component for understanding how a generation works. Now, just hesitate or hearken to say quickly, then we'll run through some of what it means to be in a generational archetype. Within generations, again, we're like at the space shuttle view, right? Way up down there. And certainly when someone talks about a generation, people can hear that as if they're being talked about me, because I live in this certain one, or I was born in a certain time. And then quite naturally, people will sit there and go, that's not how I experienced it. And that's true. That's accurate for you. Generational conversations is much more at the larger, broad area, recognizing that each individual person's story is special and wonderful and unique to them. However, most of the time, in fact, I'd say everybody I've ever spoken to, when we get into it, begins to recognize that even if they feel like they're the minority of you, like that was the way I was raised, or that wasn't my experience, they begin to recognize that, but everybody else around me of the same group that I hung out with, that is about them. That is kind of how they are. And I would add that, in my opinion, a good generational study acknowledges that there's always kind of a minority view. There's a group that the common attributes of this, whatever those attributes may be, don't match for them, or that group of people's experience was such that they kind of are living their lives in rejection of the common. But the fact that they're living in rejection to the norm is reflective that there is the norm. All right, does it make sense? Okay, so then when you do this, and you tie it in, this is the part that's matter. As I already said, the pattern will impact child rearing, and thus how a group of people living in a roughly 20-year window of time experienced culture and life. And as the pattern changes and they enter young adulthood, that will impact their lives as well. One of the things I'm often telling my peer professors who sometimes are frustrated with students, like, I can't believe these kids do blah, blah, blah. I'm like, remember, they're children, and they're merely products of the culture. They didn't decide to do a certain thing. They are just reflecting what they have experienced over their childhood. If you don't like what you see, that's probably on us as the adults. It's not on them. And so that's a generalized reflection of this idea. So what happens then, as you can imagine, as you move from unraveling to crisis, which I would say we are now, adults seek to protect their children. There's a sense of protecting the future of society. And what happens then is you see children moving into we would call overprotected state. If you can think about child rearing like a pendulum, and I don't have a slide to show you for this, but if you can think of like straight down being like good, right, or balanced. On the one side, there's underprotected, and on the other side, there's overprotected. And if you think about happening through these 4 seasons, when you come into the high, it's balanced. When you move into the awakening, it moves to underprotected. When you come back out of that, you move to balanced. And then as you move into crisis, it moves into overprotected. And then as we go forward in that time, there's a reflection of how parenting and society will speak to itself about what children should or shouldn't do. So how that works out for us then is if you were entering childhood phase during a high, then that means you're going to enter young adulthood as awakening. This is our boomer generation, our current boomer generation. If you were a child generation during awakening, Gen Xers, you're entering young adulthood during fall, or the unraveling. And you can work your way on down. And what this does then, and here it is on a slide if it works better for you. This is busy, I know, there's a lot. You go, wait, what is all this stuff? So just go here. Here's high. This is post-World War II. So here's our high, and here's our boomers, right? And there's our GI generation, the won the war for us. Here's the crisis, Great Depression, World War II. We'll talk about it more in a minute. There they are. There's the GI generation, greatest generation, some would say. My parents are here. My parents were born in 1938, 1940. They're part of the silent generation. They're the last part before the boomer generation. And then here's my group, the Gen Xers. I was born in 1964, so I'm part of the leading edge of Gen Xers, born in the time of the awakening. This is our fourth great awakening, though Christians don't like to call it that, so you know it better as the 60s. But the 60s were a spiritual awakening. And it's not 1960 to 1969. It's more like 1963, 64, post-Kennedy assassination, through roughly the 70s, all the 70s. Some would argue through Reagan's election in 80, 81, 82. Again, Reagan's election was yesterday, so it's so close, we don't really call it. Yeah?
So everything is developing around us, right? And the generations will be different. So how, is the pattern just going to keep on going the same, or is it
We're going to come to that. That's a good question. Is the pattern going to keep going? That's a key question to ask. For 500 years, it stayed the same. So we have 500 years, but I'll answer that question in more depth at the end, I promise, Hannah. Okay. So then, what this leaves us with is 4 archetypes. And again, Strauss and Howe go way in depth, and this could be another 2-hour lecture all by itself. About when you look at our historic myths, not only Anglo-American history, but European history, you see these myths over and over and over and over again. And for each one of the archetypes, there is a consistent myth, and I mean like Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, the Star Wars, still, when you look at Star Wars and you look at Luke and Leia, you look at Han, and you look at Obi-Wan Kenobi, you see this. It's all right there. Okay. So now what does this mean for us? Well, these archetypes are in a repeated pattern that match the seasons. They never come out of this order. And that's because of how they're raised and what the area is culture that they're born into. Okay, now again, I bet I'm raising questions in some of your minds, and I don't plan on answering them. Not because I can't give you an answer, but because I don't want it to get trapped here. I love this stuff. And again, all I can tell you is I wish I had written this book, but this book is amazing. And so if you're just interested on the generational side, forget the 4 turnings, forget the seasons, you just think the generational stuff, get Strauss and Howe's book, read this book. It will change your life. It's really good stuff. It's sociological, it's historical, it's all kind of connected. Let me show it to you this way. So here's our current generations. I already mentioned this already, but there it is again. So there's our prophet generation, that's our boomers. There's our nomad generation, that's our Xers. Our hero generation, our millennials, and we're just now getting to our artist generation. So you can hear, for me, any conversation of, oh, there's millennial, then there's Gen Z, then there's iGen. Yeah, that's all wrong. That's all demographics is what that is. And that's not going to hold. A generation is always a 20 to 25-year window of time, and it's those who are born in there at a time when culture is doing certain things to itself. Now you'll notice, and this is my take on it, 1, my admission that we're close in time, and 2, my own study of generations. You notice that I've blended the years. There's a lot more here I could say. I'll just say it this way. As I said earlier about the 80 years, I do not believe personally that there's some kind of a Thursday was this thing and then Friday we flipped a switch. I call these the blend years. So my sister was born in 1961. She's very clearly a boomer. And you'll find some boomer descriptions that will include the year 64, even 65. I was born in 1964. I'm clearly not a boomer. And when you look at that, you say, well, same parents, 2.5 years apart, what's going on there? And I would just say, and there's tons more, I'd love to do a whole session on generations, I'd love it. But I would just say that there's a lot going on with, like, what's the age order of birth? Sometimes the older child can pull the younger 2 up to a generation, so you might have been born in 66, but you might feel more like a boomer. There's sometimes you can be on the other side of that. There's other things going on, obviously, for each individual. And so I just put a couple of years up there as an admission to not being clairvoyant or determinate. Now, just to kind of give you an overview, nobody get frustrated. I'm not even going to spend a long time here. Right? But the prophet archetype is a spiritually driven, you see it in the word, group. They're interested in fixing the world of its evils. They kind of struggle with authority because they're not sure they trust authority. Authority may have misled us. At this point, they're kind of crusaders. And they're always coming into the young adulthood at the time of a great awakening. My generation, we're the Nomads. Nobody wants us around. Gen X was aborted 1 in 3. Highest degree of divorce occurred during Gen X parenting. It's all gone down since then, which all matches the pattern. They're kind of left to themselves. Now, again, this pattern is 500 years old. So when I didn't show it to you because I don't have time. But there's like 7 nomad generations. There's like 6? No, yeah, I think 6 is right. There's like 6 generations, or 6 moments in time. And when you go back and you read, say, diaries or biographies of people who are your generation archetype, you're like, that's like me. And I mean, it's uncanny when you read through it. So I'm not just saying this is Gen Xers, I'm saying this is the previous nomad generation was what was called the lost generation, which came out of World War I. You read the biographies and information about people who were living in that time window, which I believe I have on this slide. No, it's right before this. This is the group born right before the civic generation. Yeah, reactive civic. So the one right before this, so born in the 1880s to 1900, it's just this all over again. And so these are the guys who end up, during the crisis, they end up kind of being the hard-nosed, no BS, just get the job done kind of person. I'm trying to make you happy. I don't care if you're happy or not. We're just going to finish this thing. And they kind of get things done. After them comes our hero generation. These are the boys who stormed the beach in Normandy. These are the boys who fought in Gettysburg. These are the boys who worked. Washington was a nomad generation. So George Washington is leading the Alexander Hamiltons, who's the hero generation. They're the young men and women who are saying, what do we got to do to get it done? They're usually raised with communal focus, everything civic. You see this in our young adults right now, all our millennials. Whether you agree with them on the things they're fighting for, they're not taking no for an answer, right? They're out there marching in the streets. And there's a sense in which the older generations are going, whoo, somebody's coming to save us, whether it's environmental or guns or whatever, the topic is, right? Matches the pattern perfectly. And then the last archetype is our artist generation. And you're just seeing this now in our youngest people. And you'll hear this a lot in a sense of how parenting has, some would argue, overprotected. It, again, matches the pattern. Very sensitive. They're coming into childhood in a crisis. So there's a sense in which they're told, hey, look, we're all sacrificing so you have a future. So just zip it. Nobody wants to hear what you have to say. Just be good, be quiet. There's a very serious and clear sense of do's and don'ts because your life depends on it. And you can see that with the pattern. Okay? I'm not going to stop for questions. If you have a question, I would always entertain a question here. 4 generational archetypes. These archetypes go through history for the same 500 years. The point for us is that the archetypes, the generations, and the cycle work connected together. So, why does this matter? I would argue that the pattern has held true to this point. Hannah, to your question. When then Senator Obama, just days before his victory in the 2008 presidential election, made this fascinating sentence. I was sitting with my wife, and I immediately grabbed my pen and paper and wrote it down because it was such a typical, wonderful, well-pointed statement that says, hey, we're in this pattern. And he said, as you may remember, we are 5 days away from fundamentally transforming America. Now, regardless of what you think about the president, either as a senator or as a candidate or as the president himself, that's not the point. The point is he makes this very provocative and clear statement, and I feel pretty certain he didn't know what he was saying in relative to this. Well, he may have. He's a very smart man. But the point was, you could see in the beginning this sense right here in 2008 of a statement of, we need to change things. And of course, within 2 years, the Tea Party movement exploded on the scene, saying, no, you're not. And you can see right then the beginning of what I call the philosophical divide that grabs the center of this debate every 80 years, which I want to give you more in a second. But I just want you to kind of see, this is why I think the pattern is holding true. In fact, let me read to you something, this part here from Strauss and Howe. This is just fascinating. Get to the right spot. Let me find it first. I should have said it. Dun, dun, dun. Right here. I'll be very sad. Okay, here we go. At this point, most likely late in the crisis era, some spark of history can be expected to ignite a new social movement. They're writing this in 1991. A secular crisis, snapping generations into their new roles. And then he kind of talks about who's going to play what. Enter the crisis of 2020. He's writing this in 1991. He has no idea who our president will be. He has no idea we will elect the first African-American president, for good or ill. I think good, but do you, right? That was transformational, right? Transforming the country. He doesn't know this when they write this. And then he talks about the climactic event may not arrive exactly in the year 2020, but it won't arrive much sooner or later. And he begins to talk about what the possibilities are. When you read it in this book, which was 97, it's even more stark how they lay out what the possibilities are. Now, they nor I am saying we're going to tell you what the crisis is, because nobody can do that. Just like I can't tell you where the hurricane's going to come. I get really frustrated. I don't know if you guys do or not. I don't watch. Because they're 2 weeks out, and they're telling us stuff, and all they're really doing is clickbait, trying to get your eyeballs, and for some people, like my mom, freaking out. Don't watch. Be ready ahead of time, because you know storms are coming. And particularly even 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time, oh, there's one out there developing. Do I have my water? Do I know where my batteries are? Do I have my plan? If I do, go back to watching ESPN, or Netflix, or reading, or gardening. And then within 48 hours, you can know. And you have enough time to really adapt. Now, if we lived on the coast, I might have something a little different to say. I think more than 48 hours if you lived on the coast. But where we live here, know the pattern and know some of the clues. And that's what we're going to kind of walk our way through. So here we go. The philosophical divide comes down to changing things. And this is the big takeaway with the Great Crisis. The explosion does answer the questions. It is solved when we get there. So, for instance, and we're going to go just back to the time of the 1600s. Strauss and Howe go further back, but for our purposes, we're just going to go right there because it's much more American focused. Okay? The debate is Parliament versus King. When it's over, the king is gone, and they go from an absolute monarchy to a legislative monarchy. 80, 90, 85 years later, the same debate happens, this time in North America, except now the debate is between a king at all or government of the people. The battle is fought, the divide is wrestled over, and they get to the other side, representative government. 80 years later, 7 years ago, the same debate happens. This time it's about how powerful the government should be, and has the government of, say, Jackson and eventually Lincoln become too powerful compared to what we had originally signed up for back in the 1770s. Civil War is fought, war is over, there's going to be a winner and a loser. The great power struggle, which we'll get to in a minute, is between whether the government should be even stronger, which is what the progressive movement called for, or not. I'll show you more in a second. During the first years of crisis, and if you think about from the past, say 10 years of our country, maybe back to 2005, in fact, you think back to both President Clinton's last election, President Bush's, both his elections, both President Obama's election, and even, shockingly, President Trump's election, they all said, I'm a uniter. I'm a uniter. I'm going to bring everybody together. Voices call for a middle ground, but once the philosophical divide is taken over, people become too determined. Now, remember, what are they fighting over? Their view of civic best. So now they realize I cannot compromise with you because you can't have a king and not a king. So there's just no way to compromise on that issue. We can't have slavery and not slavery. So once I've decided this philosophical position has become something I will go to the death for, I'll go to the death for it. And I will not compromise with you. And I'm not interested in compromising you. And I think you're wrong and probably evil. And so what do you do with evil? You banish evil. So that's how we always flow towards this crisis point. Voices who want there to be middle ground try, and they try, and of course what's happening is the two sides, and just like the old cartoons from Roadrunner and stuff, the ground is coming out from beneath me, and now there's no place for me to stand. I either have to just go down, or I have to pick a side. And you can see this in every one of the great crisis moments. There's some really famous people along the way who initially, maybe my most favorite one is John Adams. When the road to the American Revolution starts, John Adams is a moderate. He's not interested. His firebrand cousin, Sam's ready to burn everything down. And John calls him on it. And John defends the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre and gets them acquitted because they didn't do anything wrong. Only one of those two words is true. And it did happen in Boston. So it's all